When the Ukrainian government announced on April 2nd, 2022, that it had regained full control of the Kyiv region, not only was the first major battle of the Ukraine war won by Ukraine, it also marked the end of a battle that could shape the century that has just begun the most. In this video, we want to talk about the Battle of Kyiv 2022 and why its importance goes far beyond Ukraine and will shape Europe, indeed the world, in the 21st century. On February 24, 2022, Russian airborne troops landed at Kyiv Hostomel Airport with helicopters to allow reinforcements to be flown in by transport aircraft. A few hours after the full invasion began, Russian troops were already 30 kilometers away from the city center of the Ukrainian capital before the battle ended a month, a week, and a day later with an Ukrainian victory. In this video, we will briefly summarize the course of the battle, but then focus on its effects, which were felt far beyond the Ukrainian capital. I would argue far beyond Ukraine and possibly decades into the future. When the Russian troops landed in Hostomel against still disorganized resistance, they were able to occupy the all-important large airport. The advance party, which had flown in by helicopter, was to prepare the way for reinforcements to fly in from the north on Ilyushin 76 transport planes and bring reinforcements to advance directly against the town. However, the Ukrainian defenders had previously parked vehicles on the roadway to block it, and after only a few hours, a Ukrainian counterattack with heavy artillery support led to a temporary recapture of the airport. At the same time, heavy Ukrainian artillery destroyed the runway pavement, making it impossible to use the airport until repairs could be carried out. At the same time, Russian forces had penetrated across the land border from Belarus and were advancing towards the Ukrainian capital. While they made progress to the west of the Kiev reservoir, they were halted to the east at the very first city, Chernihiv. Up to 400 Wagner mercenaries had infiltrated the city in the previous weeks, and there were also reports of saboteurs who had parachuted in. For a whole week, there were repeated battles in Kiev itself, in which these infiltrated forces, who had probably intended to eliminate Zelensky and his government in order to enable a puppet government to take power, were fought. At that point, the American government asked the Ukrainian president to bring him to safety. Zelensky refused with a quote for the history books: "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." This prevented the government from making a demoralizing escape. The country's leadership was still able to act and showed the population that there was hope by not fleeing. This worked among the population, while the urban population almost turned to a levée en masse, a mass uprising. Volunteers from the civilian population were given assault rifles and bazookas, and the government called on the civilian population to make Molotov cocktails. Within 2 days, the number of Ukrainian defenders had grown by 25,000 and more, while the Russians had initially had a numerical advantage of 12-1. In order to stop the Russians, numerous bridges were blown up, and the dam at Irpin was opened to partially flood the area northwest of Kiev and thus slow down the Russians. They succeeded. Over the next 2.5 weeks, the Russians repeatedly made small gains, but their logistics had been considerably weakened by the muddy period, Ukrainian attacks, the flooding, and the traffic jam of a 60-kilometer-long convoy. By 15th of March, the Russians had advanced up to 20 to 30 kilometers east and 15 to 20 kilometers west of the city center, but they had failed to encircle the city or break through into its interior. From March 19th, the now organized Ukrainian forces carried out local counterattacks, during which the first significant territorial gains were made. Constant Ukrainian counterattacks and sometimes painful Russian losses in often uncoordinated and unprofessional armored advances without accompanying infantry had stopped the Russians in the meantime. A conquest of the city, especially a quick conquest of the city, was no longer realistic. The Russian side then declared a withdrawal on March 29th, and that it intended to concentrate on the south and east of the country in the future. Even though the Russian troops had undoubtedly not managed to achieve their military objectives through the Ukrainian resistance, the Russian government tried to sell the withdrawal, the defeat, as a gesture of goodwill. Moreover, a conquest of Kiev had never been planned anyway. This was, of course, nonsense. The Russian columns had even been accompanied by Rosgvardia units, i.e. National Guard units trained in controlling the civilian population in order to be able to control the city once it had been captured. But while the Russians had suffered an initial ignominious defeat, they managed a relatively orderly retreat without dramatic further losses. Heavy Russian artillery fire prevented the Ukrainians from advancing, while Russian armored units covered the withdrawal of the other forces. Advancing Ukrainian units discovered masses of corpses of civilians lying in the streets. Victims were found with their hands tied and shot in the back of the head. Local leaders had been abducted, and some of their bodies were only found weeks later. In short, Ukraine found the victims of the Bucha and Irpin massacres. On April 2nd, it declared the Kiev region liberated. In itself, this was just a victory in a battle, but its significance goes far beyond that, not only for the Ukrainian war itself, but also for the whole world. Many observers, including myself, thought a Russian victory was a foregone conclusion at the beginning of the war. The German finance minister Christian Lindner told the Ukrainian ambassador after the war began, "We would like to help you, but it's already over anyways," and advised the Ukrainian ambassador to admit defeat. There may also have been many in Ukraine who, although inspired by patriotism, did not give their country a chance. This changed with the victory in the battle for Kiev. It was demonstrated to every citizen in Ukraine that, despite all the weaknesses shown in 2014, their own armed forces were not only able to stop a perceived superior enemy this time, no, the Ukrainian defenders outside Kiev had even managed to defeat him. This had an impact on the war that can hardly be overstated. While Ukrainian and Russian soldiers were fighting with each other outside Kiev, negotiations on a possible peace agreement were taking place at the same time. Russia demanded that the Ukrainian armed forces be limited to 85,000 men, 342 main battle tanks, and 519 artillery pieces. The purchase of weapons was to be prohibited, which would prevent modern equipment, and a committee of guarantor powers would guarantee Ukraine's security. However, Russia was to be part of this body, and at the same time, any intervention by the guarantor powers would require unanimity, effectively giving Russia a veto power over any intervention to preserve Ukrainian sovereignty. While an agreement had not yet been reached and Ukraine had significantly different negotiation positions, particularly with regard to its armed forces and international guarantees, it was the victory in Kiev that effectively broke off the negotiations. Not only did Ukraine prove to itself and its people that it could win battles against the mighty Russian armed forces, but the discovery of the bodies in Bucha and Irpin also showed the country what a Ukraine at Russia's mercy could expect. The first arms deliveries had already been announced at the time, but nobody wants to send weapons to a defeat, especially when these weapons could be needed against an aggressive Russia. With its victory, Ukraine had also shown international supporters that arms deliveries were by no means pointless and would ultimately even be handed over to the Russians by a Kiev puppet government. On the contrary, weapons supplied by the West would be used effectively by the Ukrainians and increase Ukraine's chances of victory. At the same time, the strong sanctions against Russia that had also been imposed in the meantime fueled hopes that the Russians would soon run out of steam. Ukraine, therefore, had military successes, and the international community gave it the hope that it would stand by Ukraine's side until victory. The fact that the majority of Russian soldiers presented a pathetic picture at the time, and that Ukraine presented itself as a more competent army, added to this. At the same time, the country knew what to expect in the event of a Russian occupation. The Russian enemy would be weakened by the sanctions, foreign help would come, its own military was capable. There was therefore no longer any reason for Ukraine to accept an effective classification as a vassal of Moscow with a peace agreement. Russia's defeat in the Battle for Kyiv thus led to a revitalized Ukraine, over 90% of whose population believed in victory, including the liberation of the territories occupied since 2014. After the victory outside Kyiv, at the latest, it was clear that Ukraine would continue to fight and strive for victory. However, the victory outside Kyiv did not only have immediate consequences in Ukraine. If Russia had won in Kyiv, the war would have probably ended quickly. The West's support for Ukraine would have been meaningless in the eyes of all, and the West would have suffered another geopolitical defeat after the Afghanistan debacle just a year earlier. This would have made an invasion of Taiwan a conceivable scenario. Instead, China was confronted with how difficult it is, even for the Russian military, to win a modern war. Western sanctions against Russia foreshadowed what would be expected from the West against China if it attacked Taiwan. Whether China would really have attacked Taiwan was anything but certain, but after the Ukrainian victory in Kyiv, the probability dropped considerably because the military, political, and economic challenges in Beijing were made abundantly clear. Russia must have hoped that the war would be over quickly. Whether it was the presence of parade uniforms in the baggage of attacking troops, completely inadequate logistics of troops advancing far ahead, who did not secure their flanks at all, and therefore were left with a lack of fuel, whether it was the inadequate preparation of the soldiers themselves, some of whom were surprised that they were being shot at. All the events of the first days of the war imply that the Russians were confident of victory and did not expect any serious resistance from the Ukrainians. The war would be over in a maximum of 2 weeks because the majority of the Ukrainian forces were not ready and willing to fight. If this had been the case, the battle for Kyiv would have ended with the elimination of a Ukrainian government and a peace agreement. Viktor Yanukovych, the former Ukrainian president deposed by the 2014 revolution, had arrived in Belarus at the beginning of March, probably to take over the government in Kyiv after it had been captured, according to the reports at the time. If the Russian plan had worked and the Ukrainian armed forces and people had not put up any serious resistance, the West would have been faced with a fait accompli. A Ukraine whose weak resistance demonstrates a lack of rejection of annexation to Russia, a country that had already been defeated before it could even really react, and a dependence on Russian hydrocarbons would have made acceptance of the fait accompli likely. Vladimir Putin would have pushed the effective Russian border up to the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains with manageable effort and made the large Ukrainian industrial, economic, human and military capacities accessible to the Kremlin. Whether Russia would have used this success, together with the Western uncertainty for further advances, for example towards the Baltic states, or would have hoped for an early normalization after expanding its territory, is of course pure speculation. However, the second option in particular would have been entirely possible if the war had been quick and largely bloodless. Both the then foreign minister and current federal president of Germany, Walter Steinmeier, and the then Bavarian minister-president Seehofer, for instance, advocated a relaxation or lifting of sanctions against Russia in 2016, despite the Russian annexation of Crimea and the ongoing small-scale war in eastern Ukraine, which had led to the occupation of Ukrainian territory. Both were part of the chorus of voices emphasizing that sanctions could not be permanent. This must have fueled hopes in Russia that the West would once again swallow the bitter pill and be unable to adequately punish Russia for its invasion. All these hopes were dashed with a Ukrainian victory. The Russian war aims had become unattainable, and today it seems almost unthinkable that Russia could regain the strength to advance on Kiev in the foreseeable future. With the victory, it was clear that the war would last long enough to allow the West to get over the shock and adapt to the new circumstances. Part of these new circumstances is a new Cold War. Russia has now formed an alliance of rogue states, led by it and consisting of North Korea, Iran and Syria, with the support of Eritrea, Nicaragua and Venezuela. China stands on the sidelines as a benevolent observer. With its war of aggression, Russia has given up any pretense of accepting the existing world order and, at best, wanting to reform it. The direct consequences of this can already be seen in the UN Security Council, where it has just vetoed an observer mission to monitor UN sanctions against North Korea. Russia itself is buying weapons from North Korea in violation of UN sanctions and supplying it directly with oil, also in violation of UN sanctions. A quick Russian victory would not have undone the Russian war of aggression, but if it had gone ahead as planned by Russia, the West could have largely swallowed it and, after sulking for a while, returned to everyday life. The Ukrainian victory 2 years ago also made this impossible. Regardless of the outcome of the war, whether Ukraine wins, loses only part of its territory or is subjugated, there is now no way back. More and more NATO member states are now openly considering direct intervention in the war. Russia has once again lowered a curtain over Europe, dividing the continent into two camps. Not an iron one this time, but a bloody one. Most Western countries are planning to cut off the purchase of Russian hydrocarbons completely, and the sale of anything with even rudimentary dual-use capabilities is being restricted or prevented. The Russian defense industry has to produce for its own needs instead of supplying export customers, which reduces its influence on them. Russia must therefore look for new customers for its raw materials and products and will in future focus on China rather than Europe when it comes to mechanical engineering. For a generation, Western-oriented Europe and Russia were able to experience cooperation and coexistence. This is now likely to be over for the time being. The world will once again be divided into clear camps that are hostile to each other. Of course, there were also other military conflicts in the first 24 years of the 21st century. September 11th, 2001 helped shape the century and heralded the relative decline of the American superpower. So while 9/11 was a pivotal date that will have a major impact on the century, I don't see any other battle between military forces that has had such a profound effect on Europe and the world since the turn of the millennium. That's why I believe that the Battle of Kyiv, which ended in a Ukrainian victory 2 years ago, was the most important battle of the 21st century so far. What do you think of my assessment? Let me know in the comments section. If you liked the video, click like and subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss future videos. You can support the channel via the links in the description. That was it from me for now. Thank you for watching and I'll be back.